Hello and welcome to Photographic Connections, the podcast where we create connection to self, nature and others through the art of photography. My name is Kim Grant, the founder of Photographic Connections and your host for this podcast. And today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Anna Morgan onto the podcast. Anna is a landscape photographer, originally from the UK and now living in British Columbia. She shares how her background as a veterinarian and interest in ecological conservation has played a big role in influencing how she sees the natural world and creates her images. We also speak about the importance of slowing down, how we can invite questions through the photos we create, and how photography has helped her discover who she is. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Anna Morgan. Hi Anna, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast this week. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you because you've got a very deep philosophy when it comes to photography, and I feel your vision with your work and what you help others to do in their photography process is such a beautiful thing, and I'm really looking forward to delving into that with you today. But before we do, I wondered if you could go way back to the beginning and tell the story of what got you into photography in the first place.
Hi Kim, thank you so much for having me on. So I go back quite a long way with photography. My professional career, I've been a veterinarian, and that was my kind of goal ever since the age of 14, 15. But alongside that, even at that young age, art was a really important part of my life. So I come from a family of artists on my mother's side. And I couldn't let go of the art altogether when I did my A-levels. So I studied history of art as a AS level and continued doing art. And it was at that time that I started picking up a camera more and more. I worked in a camera shop during my gap year before university. And then it's just really been when I can take photographs. The last 10 years has been much more serious in terms of photography, and like you said, I've really developed my philosophies around photographic practices and so on.
I'd mentioned there that you've worked in the veterinary service for many years, and that's what you trained in, should I say. And I know that conservation plays quite a big role, and the connection with the ecology of the landscape as well plays quite a big role in your work. I wondered if you could go into that a little bit as well.
It does. One of the motivations I had for becoming a veterinarian in the first place really came from leafing through National Geographic magazines when I was a kid. And I really enjoyed the wildlife and the wild places aspects of what National Geographic brings to us. And then I kind of lost sight of that a little bit at university, because you go down a very specific path when you're studying. But after being a vet for quite a number of years, I kind of reinvigorated that interest. So I had that academic interest in conservation, but at the same time I was developing my photographic skills, and it kind of just all very obviously melded together and made sense to me at the time to incorporate ecological concepts into my photography as well.
So how do you go about bringing this ecological concepts into your imagery?
So there's a number of ways, but for me, the biggest way really is just in being self-reflective and having a very kind of iterative and reflexive process to my photography. So I tend to make very conscious decisions to observe and to understand the landscapes I'm photographing, to question a lot of the things that I'm photographing, whether that's the shape of the landscape, whether that's the types of plants that are in it, how that affects people, how cultures shape landscapes and so on. And then I go through a cycle, probably fairly subconsciously now, and I bring that into my photography, and I try to, showcase some of that with my work. But it's not, it's really just a very personal journey. It's not out there to tell people, this is what you should be looking for, or this is how you should approach conservation yourself. This is just my inner journey, and that's how I connect the two.
I think it's really nice when somebody has got a much deeper knowledge of their subject matters. And I think it's really beautiful that you've brought this conservation element and you're studying in the vet world in together with everything you're doing in your journey. Because as you say, it's a very self-reflective thing. And each photographer and artist has got their own process, their own story, their own journey. And it's very clear that you're quite self-aware of your interests and how you're then going on to bring all of your interests and the things that you studied and combining it with your photography. Do you feel it's always been that way for you, or has it been something that you've began to reflect on and see that connection within your work as time's gone by?
I don't think it's always been that way for me. I think doing my master's in conservation medicine was really when it all started for me. So that started in 2017. And I think prior to that, whether it's a certain immaturity, whether it's, just a certain life stage, but I was always one of those, like a lot of people, I wanted to travel, I wanted to see places, and I kind of got bogged down in a lot of that. And it was only really, 6-7 years ago now where I started bringing that into my photography much more intentionally. And it's kind of, it's deepened since then.
Yeah, it's definitely a process, isn't it? I think it takes us a while to maybe work out who we are and work through a lot of things and get back to that place of our innate interests. But you can see, I think, there with your story that there has been this continued interest of almost self-development and inner reflection and this connection with the land around you that you've been able to bring together almost since day one, but it's just become much more of a more conscious, I guess, pursuit now that you've moved further down your journey. So where did your interest in like nature and landscapes first stem from? Was that something that you were interested in as a child?
Yes, I definitely. I was lucky enough. I grew up just outside London, but in an area that was rural enough that there was lots of woodlands around me. We had a big garden, and I would spend all my days out there, whether it's looking at worms or trees or, whatever it might be. I think I've always had that very innate interest. And then as a young teenager, I became more interested in animals and looking after animals and basically anything animal related. That was where I was at. And that obviously propelled me into becoming a veterinarian. But it's, I've always had an interest in ecology, in environment, in understanding what the issues are in our environments. And that's just, I guess the academic side of things has brought that in to a much more significant degree.
Yeah. It's interesting because when I look at your work, you photograph a lot of very intricate and very artistic scenes within nature. And you're speaking there about this connection as a child and almost having this wonder to the smaller, insects and bugs and all that's going around. And then, going on to be really interested in animals. But you don't seem to do too much wildlife photography. So where has that segregation, do you think, come from? I feel like it would be a natural progression for you to enjoy wildlife, but you've kind of gone off more into the landscape, which is interesting.
Yeah, I've often thought about that question myself. I really enjoy seeing animals in the landscape. And, even if I've got my camera, I'll often put my camera down just to watch the animals in the landscape, just again that awe and that wonder. I think part of it for me is the photographic practices, the way people photograph or at least the way I perceive that people photograph wildlife, is really different to the way people photograph landscapes. And what I really get back from photography is that that slowness, that kind of element of discovery and surprise that I find I get from landscapes. And I think wildlife photography is just a different approach, which I don't think I enjoy quite as much. But I do enjoy seeing the animals in the landscape, and I enjoy following them and understanding and asking questions in the same way that I do with the less obvious subjects, let's say.
It's interesting. In my early 20s, I did quite a bit of conservation work in Scotland with various charities, mostly sort of land management stuff, which of course then had a knock-on effect on the wildlife that interacted with that. So I was just thinking there as you were speaking, I guess a lot of wildlife images that we see, there's a lot of similarities between them when we see a number of photographers photographing the same species and the same animals. But when it comes to landscape, it almost gives us much more opportunities or much more choice of different things we can photograph. But the thing is, those wildlife and animals wouldn't be there if it wasn't for the landscape and the ecology and all of the plants and everything that make up that landscape. So it's almost like even though you're not photographing the wildlife, you're photographing their habitat. And without that, they wouldn't be there. So I guess it does play in together quite well, doesn't it?
It does. And it's interesting that you're mentioning, so I'll come back to the Scottish landscapes, but here in British Columbia, there's a very clear and taught element in schools and so on about the relevance of species like salmon in the environment and how they literally shape the landscape. It's not just the rivers that they swim in, but the way they nourish the soils, the plants, the cycles that happen in the forests. And it's all connected. You cannot take one species, no matter how small, out of an environment and still have it be the same ecological environment. And so that does come into my photography and the philosophies that go into taking the image. But going back to the Scottish landscapes, when I did my master's thesis, as part of that, I interviewed Peter Cairns, who he's very much involved in rewilding in Scotland and any kind of rewilding initiatives that are happening in Scotland. And it's really fascinating listening to him talk. And one of the things that's important to remember in Scottish landscapes is that by and large, there's very little wilderness left. So when we talk about Scottish landscapes, the majority of us kind of imagine the moors, moorland with deer and so on, but that's not the natural landscape. They're very much managed landscapes. And, that helps us question, well, what would it look like? What would a wild landscape actually look like? What species would be there? How has losing beavers, for example, reshaped Scotland, and what would it take to get back to that? And then, that's so ingrained with cultural aspects and the human side of things. A lot of people don't want these animals back in their backyards. So it's highly complex and really, really interesting. And so all of that goes into, all of those thoughts go into my images, whether or not that's seen or perceived by anyone who's viewing them, I can't say, but that certainly comes into what I'm doing.
I'm really glad you mentioned Peter Cairns there. I remember a couple of years ago I watched a video that his team created as part of Scotland, the Big Picture, and it was showcasing these iconic landscapes we see in Scotland, the Isle of Skye, Glencoe, the Highlands. They're so ecologically depleted, it's unbelievable. And it's funny because I don't have any connection to those landscapes at all. And I'm very fortunate to live in a part of Scotland that is surrounded by trees, and I feel very grounded and at home here. Of course, we've not got the same wildlife species that you guys do in Canada, and we would have had many, many years ago before everything happened in Scotland. But I find it really interesting because until recently, I never understood why I felt so empty when I went up to the Highlands. Like, there's beauty there, and especially in the coast, I love it. But out with the wooded areas and the mountains, I just feel so just empty. And it's really interesting because I remember I approached you many, many months ago to do this podcast, and we've rearranged a couple of times. But what's fascinating is I literally came back from BC myself last week, and seeing the landscape over there, the nature over there, how much trees there is and how many different wildlife species you have, it really brought it home to me, I think, what we've lost here in Scotland. And while I love being able to go out and not have to worry about wolves and bears and coyotes and stuff, I found it fascinating walking around the woodlands and learning about the salmon that you spoke about there and the beaver and all that as well. You know, there's so much was in the woodlands, kind of educating people about the cycle and everything that's part of it. And it's just really nice because what you've said there, it's kind of bringing it home to me and really implementing the things that I learned and that really, like I say, hit home to me when I was over in BC.
Yeah, it's really great that you've seen that recently, actually, because then it's at the forefront of your mind. But it's interesting because I think here in BC, there's a lot of practices that are going on that are kind of hidden from the public view. So clear-cut forestry is not something you hear about back home in the UK happening in BC, but it's very widespread here. And, you know, we're still logging old growth forest, which is crazy. And having grown up in a country where we have lost all of that, like you said, we've lost our natural ecology, to then see it kind of replaying here. And often it's the same reasons. It's all economic. It's really sad to see, but it's also hard to judge, and it's hard to, be able to put a stop to that because the same issues, human issues, continue playing out. And then, of course, there's an added complication with the relationship that Indigenous peoples have with the forests, which, colonization has put on them. So a lot of people rely on forestry as their source of income, and so it's not for me or for anyone to kind of judge where they're at. So it's highly complex and very, very difficult. But ultimately, although we have like huge vastness of wilderness, it is slowly being depleted.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you're saying that because I'm not really very aware of the situation in Canada, but I remember speaking to my friend who lives there, who I was staying with, and I said, I feel like people here are so much more connected with nature than they are in Scotland. But she was like, they kind of are, but they're kind of not, because she's been over here herself. And I just found it interesting that living in such a more of a wilderness, I guess, that there is still in some cases this disconnect. But I guess that's one of the beautiful things about something like photography is you're able to go out there and connect with that and then bring some of these stories or introspections around how you're feeling when you're out there and what you're maybe coming across in your imagery. It gives you an interesting outlet and way of, I guess, like I say, telling these stories and that with people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's really interesting because it is telling a story, but they're my stories. They're not somebody else's stories. And they're my thoughts and my questions. And I think the beautiful thing about photography is when done well, you're inviting questions. You're not kind of giving people the answers. And I try at least, consciously to be really careful not to tell people what conservation should look like or say, this is what you should be doing. I make a conscious effort and, I don't know how well I do it, but I try very hard to just simply give people what I see without kind of a background explanation necessarily. Let the image speak for itself most of the time.
That's a beautiful way to approach it. Yeah, it's lovely just to, like you say, almost pose these questions, but not like impose anything on anybody. It's just like you're almost touching the surface and just transmuting what you're seeing and feeling, and raising things potentially with people, but without actually raising it. It's kind of like a very internal process, which is very much what you're all about. And I know mindfulness plays a really big part in your photography, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah, so mindfulness is something that I really delved in much deeper to when I started my master's, specifically when I started doing the research part of the master's, and now I teach it, and it's kind of integral to everything I do. And I think it's really easy for a lot of people to kind of band the word around and assume they know what it means, and assume that oh yes, I'm being mindful. But I think it takes a real depth, and I think that takes a lot of time to develop, just kind of getting deeper and deeper in a kind of spiral, really. So just becoming more aware, consciously observing, letting thoughts go, not dwelling on things, not judging, and continuing that process. So it's something that I don't think that I would have been able to make the images I do without the mindfulness impact.
Yeah. It's really, it adds a different dimension to your photography, doesn't it? Like I realise in my practice, I've been doing mindfulness kind of naturally for many years, but it's not until I really delved into it and started to understand more what it was and the much more finite details of it, rather than just we're sitting and we're in the present moment. It's so much deeper than that. And it takes, like you kind of said there, a process of really tuning in, of reflecting, of just letting go of kind of, like you say, any judgment there, and allowing ourselves to really see what's going on around us, and slowing down. And I know that's something I read on your website, was this importance of slowing down. How do you feel that slowing down process helps you to connect more deeply with the subjects that you then go on to photograph?
So I think there's two things I'll say about slowing down. Now, a lot of people assume that the slowing down is just a physical slowing down. You know, we literally take things slower, or we don't take as much on. But to me, that's not really what slowing down means. To me, slowing down is making space in your mind for awareness. So essentially, slowing down and mindfulness, although they're two slightly different things, the nuances are actually relatively subtle, because it's more about taking the time to observe your thoughts, and doing that in conjunction with your photography. So you might pick up things as you're reading, or as you're doing any day-to-day task, and then you bring that to your photography. And then while you're doing your photography, things might come to you, thoughts, and you observe them. You don't judge them. You let them go. You move on. You take your images, and then you bring that back to your life. And so it's kind of a cyclical practice, really. The slowing down, you know, there can be a physical slowing down. It does help, obviously, if you're not trying to do multitask so many things at once. But it's really about learning to be present and really knowing what that means.
It's really beautiful that you described that there, because I think many people don't feel like they have the time to physically slow down. But it's almost like, you know, you're kind of saying there, although that part of it is nice, it's actually just that kind of presence and almost slowing down of the mind. And just when we are in that moment, whether we can only spend 15 minutes in nature or 5 hours, it's like just in that time, just slowing down a bit and being very conscious of what's happening in that moment. It almost is like, it doesn't matter what our time constraints are in many respects. It's more the internal and mental process. That's kind of what I got from what you said there.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, I mean, an example of what that could look like in the field, if you go out to photograph, I mean, I think a lot of people, and, you know, I include myself in this, I used to go out and I used to say, okay, I'm going to go on this hike. And I will see this, and this, and I might make photographs along the way. Or, I'm going to go and see this particular viewpoint. And so you start your walk or your hike and you think you're going to get to the end of that walk. You think you're going to get to a certain location and then turn back or circle round or whatever it might be. And I think slowing down and being present is really about letting go of all of that. So you go out with your camera. Yes, you might set off in a particular direction, but it's okay to stop at a location 100 meters up the path and stay there for 5 hours. And I've made some of my best images on hikes that I never finished. And I think, we always have this mindset of, well, we can't stop because we've got to go and, we've got to do this and then we've got to get to this point and then we've got to get back. Well, why? Why don't we just enjoy the moments? And if we see something along the way that really speaks to us, what is it inside of us that's pressuring us to keep going? So I think that's where slowing down and becoming present really helps.
That is so, so beautiful. It's almost like posing these questions to ourselves so we can really reflect on not just our photographic process, but how we approach life, isn't it? And I love your example there. We've got a community online here as part of Photographic Connections, and one of our members who lives in Australia, recently she went out into the woods and she just sat in one spot for, I can't remember how long it was. I think it was like 2 hours, but she just got totally immersed in what was going on around her and started creating images. And she was like, I didn't really move, but it was like I let go of that pressure to have to move and to complete the walk and to keep going. And I let myself just be. And it's the most beautiful thing. And, they say, don't they, that if we don't take that time to simply just be and be present, it's very difficult to work out, to feel that connection, but also to work out, I guess, who we are and where we're going in life and find the answers that we may be needing to any struggles or problems that could be going on for us as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, if we just have this kind of single-minded focus where we are having to complete the walk or having to do this or having to do that, that's an external pressure that's put upon us. That's not learning about who we are. And I think, you do a lot of coastal photography, for example. And we just came back from a couple of days camping, and we were at a lake, and, I spent a couple of hours just by the lake shore, and it's just so interesting and fun, and mesmerizing to watch water for that length of time. And if you only go down there for 10 minutes, you think, oh, okay, well, the clouds look like this and the water looks like that. Okay, great. I'll turn around and go back. You're missing so many opportunities. So, enjoying the opportunities that are actually there in the moment is more fulfilling than trying to make opportunities out of thin air, essentially.
Yeah. Oh, I totally feel that. And that's very fresh for me because this morning I went to my local pond that you can walk to from my house. And it's normally somewhere that I just go for a walk. But this morning I was like, I'm going to take my camera with me. I've never photographed it before. I'm going to take my camera with me. And I'd expected to walk around the whole thing, sort of taking it in and looking for potential ideas. But I just stayed in like the first couple of meters because the sun had just risen and the way the water was moving and the ripples within it and then the ducks going around and creating more ripples. I was just so mesmerized by it, and I ended up being there for 10 minutes just filming little video clips of it and photographing some of the ripples and the reflections on the water. And I was just like, this is literally the spot that most people just sit and feed the ducks, and they just feed it and then off they go again. And I'm just like, wow. And there was actually a lady out walking her dog, and she was like, it's so beautiful. So every time you come here, the reflections and the texture of the water is different. And I was just like, you're right, it really is. And it was lovely to hear her reflect on that as well. When she goes on her dog walks every morning, she notices that, which was beautiful.
Yeah, and it's a good point as well. She's going on a dog walk and she's observing the same things. You don't need the camera in your hand, and you don't need to actually be making photographs to do any of this stuff. I mean, obviously we're on a photography podcast, so we're talking about photography, but anyone can do this observation. And actually one of the most powerful things to train your mind is to go out without the camera, because then you've got like a certain freedom. There's no pressure to make images because you can't. So you're kind of just forced almost into a situation where actually observing is more important than in the moment.
It's like taking that pressure away for us, like people that do photography, isn't it? It's like not going out with expectations and just responding to what you come across when you're there. Almost like going back to your story of like going on hikes and having set locations you want to get to. It's just like go on your hike, but then just don't have any expectations, and just see what you connect with in the moment, because it can often be completely different things to what you expected. And I find the more you can connect in that moment without preconceived ideas and expectations, often the more meaningful our images can become. Have you found that in your photography as well?
100%. I think, going out with an expectation means that you are single-mindedly focused on that expectation. And there's some parts of photography where that makes sense. Say if you're planning like astrophotography or something, it makes sense that you kind of need to know where the Milky Way is going to be, and you need to have a viewpoint where you're actually going to be able to see it. And you need clear skies. So there are certain elements where that can be applicable, but I find that it's like really, really overused, that people generally go out with an expectation. And even if those expectations are really deep in your subconscious, so, you might think, I'm going to be back for this time, or, you don't expect to, for your battery to not be charged, or you don't expect that you're going to drop a filter, or whatever it might be. These things aren't in your expectations. So a lot of the time they're deep in the subconscious. And then when something happens and it's not part of what you expected, you get really frustrated. So I think, I always try to go out with as few expectations as I can possibly have. And that's really hard. I'm not suggesting you can just click your fingers and go, okay, today I'm going to go out with no expectations whatsoever, because inevitably there are things deeper there. But the more you can practice that, the easier it becomes. And, and then you can see all these opportunities around you that you would have just totally missed otherwise, I think.
Yeah, I've totally found that in my process as well. And I guess this sense is that you're almost just being in the moment. And there's a sentence on your website that says that photography is a vehicle into the journey of being. And you've really, I think, explained that there, not just in being in the moment, but also the being of being human, I guess. Like what was your kind of thought process when you say that photography is a vehicle into the journey of being?
So there's a fair amount of philosophy that goes into that in terms of ontology. So when you think about being and you think about who you are, that's quite a difficult concept. If somebody says, "Who are you?" most people go, well, my name is Anna. I was born here. I am this many years old. I do this for a living. But that doesn't really answer the question, like, who are you? So being able to come to know yourself is probably the most productive thing you can do for your creativity. But a lot of people don't want to know themselves. A lot of people kind of shelter themselves from themselves because they don't want to hear it or see it. They might be ashamed of certain things or scared of certain things. And so, we're very good as humans at kind of blocking parts of who we are. And I guess going back to the mindfulness and the slowing down and the being present is just, understanding that all of those things that make us who we are equally beautiful. So, it doesn't matter whether what that looks like in the public eye, on Instagram. It's about understanding who we are as individuals. And then I think, going back to that sentence, photography for me has a real capacity to allow you to ask yourself those questions, because it's such a reflexive process, or it can be. And I think when done right, it can really help. I mean, it's helped me to understand who I am and to accept who I am without that judgment piece.
Yeah, and you are right in saying there, going into this kind of discovering who we are it's a scary process for a lot of people, and a lot of people really struggle to even begin that process. And we're very stuck in our routines and in, I guess, our conditioning from childhood and the things that we've just done over the years without really thinking about it. And when we start delving into ourselves to begin with, there's like so much resistance. And I know when I began delving into myself, I just believed the only way to do it was through traditional talking therapy, which is something that I did delve into at the time, but it never got to the root of things for me. And it wasn't through creating this connection to nature or rediscovering it, because I'd lost it a little bit when I was a teenager, and rediscovering it in my late teens and combining that with photography, and then really starting to feel into what I was seeing and feeling. And then it brought up things for me, but in a very positive way. And I almost feel like that's one of the reasons why I started Photographic Connections, because I feel like photography has been such a vehicle in helping me navigate my struggles in life and discover myself. But if it can do that for me, then potentially it can do it for somebody else, because I think everybody needs that tool or that vehicle. And for not everybody it's going to be photography, it could be something completely different. But if anybody's listening to this that loves photography, it could potentially be an avenue to explore and go down. And that's certainly, I feel, something that you and I both have in common.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really beautifully put. And, to your point about being conditioned, we are conditioned. We're conditioned from a very, very young age. You should do things this way, or you should do things that way. And we're kind of institutionalized from a very young age. We go to school, we have to behave in a certain way. These things are often not seen or understood. And so, and we explain it to our children, like, we're doing this way because X, Y, and Z, and without really fully understanding why it is we're explaining it that way. So, and then, there's pressure from society to conform, to dress a certain way, to, you've got to get, quote unquote, a proper job. There's pressure to get married. There's pressure to have families, and I think anything that's outside of that, norm is not the right word, but that societal norm is then questioned, and so I think everybody has their own issues, their own little traumas that they deal with, even if they've had a very kind of happy childhood. So being able to learn about who you are is quite a long process, and you can't really do that as a young person, because you do have so many things kind of imposed on you, and I feel like it's only really slightly later in life, when you have a certain amount of freedom, that you can really start discovering all of that for yourself.
Yes. Yeah. No, 100%. It takes time, doesn't it? And we need to get to that space where not only are we ready, but in many ways that we're old enough and, like you say, have that almost that space and autonomy to do it, which is sometimes difficult for some people. But I feel it's definitely a journey worth taking for anybody that is interested in discovering themselves more and overcoming some of this conditioning, because it releases something. And if you can find a medium like photography to help you do that, then it can be a beautiful process. And one thing I'd love to end on is, you mentioned there that you were brought up near London and you now live in BC, in Canada. Did you find moving over there, how did it affect your photography, but also your outlook on life?
That's a really interesting question. And there were a lot of changes at that exact time. So I had So I sold my clinic kind of 5 months before we moved. My son was born 4 months before we moved. So it's kind of hard to untangle what parts of me necessarily affected my photography, or whether that's becoming a mom or whether it is the move. But I would say in a big part, it's kind of the freedom. I found that when I was working near London, and life is like really hectic there. It's so busy. There's so many, going back to the pressures, so many pressures. And I tend to cope pretty well under pressure, but I realized I wasn't enjoying all of that. And so moving here kind of took a lot of that away. And, there are different challenges here, but there's definitely less of a pressure, and there's much more freedom in the landscape, I find. It's less cultivated. You have the wildness of it all. And so I think that made a big difference to my photography, but also that time, like I said, it's hard to untangle the threads, because my son was born, which meant I also had to physically slow down. That was kind of imposed onto me by default. And so that really helped me get into the mindset of looking for different opportunities and not being focused on, a single goal or anything like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation there. Thank you for sharing that. And I think one thing I realised when I went over there, I didn't take my camera with me, but I just went simply for a holiday and to see what the country was like. But there was just a very different feel over there, I found. Like, I don't know whether you'd say it was energetically or whatnot, maybe just being a much newer country. I find in Scotland there's a very denseness, and while I find it very grounding and it really helps me with my mindful process, I also almost found when I was in BC that there was so many ideas going through my mind, and it was a very different feel in many respects. And there was just so much with all that wilderness as well. I found it almost a bit overwhelming about where to start and try and pick an area, because it's just, there's so much to see and to do. So it was a very different feel. Like if I'd brought my camera with me, I don't know how I would have approached it. But of course, when you start living somewhere like that, you just adapt to it, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. And, to add, I think every time you do any kind of significant travel, or you have a significant life event, that feeds back into who we are as people. So whether you're consciously thinking about it or not, you will now bring some of what you have learned, whether that doesn't have to be like learned in terms of, known knowledge, educational knowledge, but it could be spiritual knowledge or emotional knowledge. And so you've now got this ability to bring that back into the photography that you do in Scotland. So it all kind of feeds into that, and just understanding how that happens within us, and observing that is also pretty powerful.
Yeah, no, 100%. I totally feel that. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. And I've had such a joy speaking with you today, Anna. I think there's a lot of wisdom in what you've shared with us. And I feel there's a lot of people listening that will be able to gain a lot of insight and maybe think about their own journeys a little bit differently, and their connection with photography, and most specifically nature, and thinking more maybe about the ecological perspective of what they're photographing. Where has the landscape and the subjects they're photographing come from? How does it play in with the bigger picture? And then relating it to their own life. There's so much there, and I feel there's so much more we could delve into. But for now, I just want to say a huge thank you. And if anybody would like to connect with you further, where can they go to find you?
Well, the best place I would say is my website, which is annamorgan.ca. And otherwise I am on the usual social media. Instagram is usually where I post. But certainly, if you feel so inclined and you want to hear more, subscribe to my newsletter, because that's where you get a lot of my insights. Thank you so much for having me, Kim. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Oh, you're very welcome, and thank you once again for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this week's podcast. It really does mean the world to me. If you'd like to get further involved with Photographic Connections, including joining our online community, you can find all the details at photographicconnections.com. I will also very shortly be releasing dates for immersive photography weekends in Scotland for 2024. So if you're potentially interested in coming along to one of these, while you're on the website, you can sign up to our newsletter. Dates will be released to community members first and newsletter subscribers thereafter. I also love to hear from you, so if you have any suggestions of people that you'd like to see on the podcast, please feel free to send me a message either through the website or through our Instagram page. And now that this podcast has come to an end, there's only one thing left for you to do. It's time to pick up your camera and head outdoors. There's so many incredible photographic opportunities just waiting for you to discover.